The Taliban have issued a ban on women's voices.
Oppressing women isn't just bad for women. It's also bad for men. Make that bad for entire countries.
The surest way to curse a nation is to subjugate its women.
Pre-modern sexist customs can make countries more violent and unstable. So what lessons should governments and policymakers learn?
Of course, women are part of making societies peaceful and stable.
And is the world learning those lessons?
What's at stake is more violent societies and more repressive societies.
Wasulu uman bisara gude kamani asan kanta maindi doru selafi ita bro duru bzol dak ma ita binyaka mtato asan ita bijasa adita.
In 2016, Deborah Akuchi's village was raided by armed men who stole her family's cattle.
Akutai mashabab de mon kudu lima san mon bagder turju wara bagara de kan mon bagder jawara.
The family's attempt to pursue the raiders ended in tragedy.
Bizaman dagde roka tuluman lakini obiga mutu de manatu isa bizekir jado hal.
In South Sudan, the world's newest country, thousands have lost their lives in cattle raids like this in recent years. Cattle raids have destabilized the country, and they're a problem closely linked to the oppression of women. Poverty and the legacy of civil war are contributing factors. But another factor incentivizing violent cattle raids is an antiquated practice known as bride pricing. For a man to get married in South Sudan, he must pay his wife's family.
The practice of bride price was traditionally a social approach of families getting to know each other, cementing the relationships. And over the years, it has become much more looking at women as an asset that can be traded.
Commodifying women in this way breeds a cycle of violence and instability, which Deborah knows only too well.
Lekano indu bogar to morrasan mon binyakam kan barnami to alo deramul bagara de kano der zoju. Ukid biga nyakam de o kaman feel ke lo raji basano beja joju mara. Bita fa ketir kaliske kan ma da fa ketir bini ade ma bodi leta. Tanin bo sulu sala mia kamsin tuldu mia sab zol indu mali ya osul fi bet. Zol ta mal kan jafi bet o bidafa alfi.
Getting that many cows through legitimate means is nearly impossible for some men. So they raid their neighbors in order to get enough to get married. Although not all bride pricing causes lethal raids, almost half the world's population lives in countries where it's practiced.
The very custom of bride price itself lends itself to the mentality in the groom and the groom's family is we paid for you, so we can do whatever we want to. If we choose to beat you, that's fine.
Bride pricing also drives down the age at which girls are married off. Another problem, which is associated with instability within societies.
The parents are poor, and if they marry off their daughter, they can get some cash, some cattle, some goats. It shows us how nations are not sufficiently prioritizing advancing the equality of women and girls, are not prioritizing access to basic social services, including health and education.
Girls who marry young are more likely to suffer domestic violence, and men who witness or commit violence at home are more likely to bring it into the public sphere. But there's still a strong incentive for early marriage. The earlier a family marries off their daughter, the earlier they can cash in a bride price. Deborah was forced to marry at 16.
There are some body malena stana bongar. Dajal basil malal da pawarita de san besado nas. Yaga surita fizoja.
A fifth of the world's young women were married before the age of 18. a 20th before 15.
The so-called marriage of girls is rape. The child cannot consent. It just cuts away the lives of the little girls.
Customs which are bad for women often correlate with social instability. Take polygamy. Or more precisely, polygyny, the practice of a man taking more than one wife.
Bride price and polygyny are like kissing cousins. They go hand in hand. In one recent study that came out, 90% of women in polygynous unions felt emotional, even physical distress from the circumstances of the polygyny. Sky-high rates of depression and anxiety and so forth.
Polygyny is a feature of life in all of the 20 most unstable states in the Fragile States Index, compiled by the Fund for Peace, an NGO. By guaranteeing that there will not be enough wives to go around, it provokes anger among the young men who miss out, usually the poor ones. If the richest and most powerful 10% of men have, say, 4 wives each, the bottom 30% of men can't marry. And a large population of frustrated single men is a boon for armed groups.
It becomes a recruiting tool for armed groups. They might take advantage of this kind of a situation and do things like promise a wife as a way to recruit men into armed groups.
So if practices like polygamy and bride pricing contribute to making countries more unstable, why is it hard to put an end to them? There are many factors at play, but one which should not be ignored is the tradition of the male kinship group.
The male kinship group is the first government that we find in human history. There are powerful male kinship groups in large nations such as India, even China, throughout the Caucasus.
The male kinship group, or clan, emerged largely for self-defense. Men who were related were more likely to unite against enemies. These men brought in wives from elsewhere, who were treated as outsiders. Today, women in these societies often still have no right to property or leadership roles.
To keep that fraternity strong, you have got to absolutely suppress any expression of women's interests or the desire for women's voice. They cannot be autonomous because men depend on them to reproduce the next generation, as well as sexual service, domestic work service, etc., etc., etc.
Male kinship groups can run entire countries or smaller areas. Across Central Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, clans can pose challenges to state governance. The more prevalent male kinship groups are in a country, the more violent and unstable it tends to be. If you rank countries on a scale of 0 to 16 to give them a score of how misogynistic they are, 0 being the best possible score and 16 being the worst, and plot that against scores for how fragile the states are, a pattern emerges. There are some exceptions, but generally, the more sexist a country is, the more unstable it is. Rich democracies do well. Australia, Sweden, and Switzerland all manage the best possible score of 0 in terms of misogyny, and are low on the Fragile States Index. Iraq scores a bad 15 for sexism, alongside Nigeria, Yemen, and Pakistan. Only South Sudan does worse. All rank as very fragile states.
One of the larger consequences of patriarchal institutions is that they demobilize women from being politically active. And that's why we might actually see more conflict, because when women are able to politically mobilize non-violently, they are much more successful in enhancing reforms in that society. And so there's no need to turn to violent conflict because we're seeing that political change organically.
So nations that fail women tend to fail. But things can also work the other way around. Countries that empower women tend to do better.
If you invest in girls, they grow up to be healthier women. When you invest in women, families end up being healthier and wealthier, and you end up with more resilient societies when women have control of their resources and their decision making.
The more we have women in decision making, the easier it is for women in society who may not hold a position to also effectively contribute into the development of their nations.
Revolutions that involve women usually end up with better governments than revolutions that are led only by men.
That's because the movement receives more legitimacy the more diverse it is. It becomes more legitimate and much more of a quote-unquote threat to the regime, such that they are more likely to make concessions.
Higher levels of women's political participation are associated with a lower risk of conflict relapse.
We know over the long term, over the 15-year long term of that peace process, the countries are 35% more likely to stay peaceful because a woman was part of it.
Liberia, in West Africa, knows this better than most.
We are at the original ground where the mass action for peace started in 2003.
Asatu Bakene is, in her own way, a revolutionary. She was one of hundreds of women who were instrumental in bringing Liberia's second civil war to an end over 20 years ago.
We organized and mobilized. We sat there under the rain, under the sun, trying to get the attention of the government.
She and her fellow activists demonstrated until they got a promise from the then president, Charles Taylor, to open peace talks with the rebels. A delegation of women then went to Ghana, where the talks were taking place, to continue to apply pressure on the warring factions during the peace process.
The group in Ghana, they held the warring faction hostage, where they could not even leave the room. The warring faction were forced, they were pressurized by the women. And then that's when they became sober and they decided to sign the peace accord.
The peace held, and Asatu, like many other women in Liberia, is still focused on making sure it stays that way.
We keep engaging people who we believe are threats to the peace. So we continue with our awareness, we continue with radio programs, community programs. For the women, when they stand for something, they stand for it for good.
Female negotiators have shaped long-lasting peace processes in other places, such as Colombia and Northern Ireland. But despite these successes, women continue to make up a small minority of peace negotiators. In 2022, only 16% of negotiators in peace processes led or co-led by the United Nations were women, a decline from 23% in 2020.
It's painful that the world is yet to fully embrace the lessons that are known.
There are positive signs that the world is learning to abandon customs which oppress women. Patrilineal culture, where clan membership is based on male lineage, is becoming less common, and polygamy is in decline. But there is still a lot to do.
Getting women on the title to whatever house or land the family holds, raising the marriage age for girls, right, to 18, would be an absolute revolution in terms of helping to stabilize countries.
Changing national policies is the job of governments, but Western countries and organizations which donate to the developing world can play their part too. And rich countries should look at their own treatment of women as well. Policymakers who fail to consider the interests of half the population will struggle to build a better world. Back in South Sudan, it's a message that Deborah is keen to pass on to others.
So, batal to kan wedi jana de ligol lisa suker ma bagder wosul fi umur sa joja dagde indo ajat ketir fogo kana de raja le asil mana kele masil majana tay ay wosul kan sibu fursa le nuswan belad biger kan bigala ita kunitum bifak mana.
Hi, I'm Tamara Jokes-Boer, U.S. policy correspondent at The Economist. If you'd like to read more about gender insecurity, please click on the link opposite. If you'd like to watch more of our Now and Next series, please click on the other link. Thanks for watching, and please don't forget to subscribe.